I did something during this project I never had the patience or time to do. I tried making an American city in City Skylines. If you're familiar with the game, and especially if you've ever tried doing this yourself, you're probably aware this is a shortcut to having a mental breakdown. We'll chalk this up to Colossal Order, the developers of City Skylines, being from Finland, with the development team back in 2015 only being 9 people. Regardless, in CS1, American cities are just impossible to make. Despite American cities being pretty inefficient and our suburbs potentially being more harmful for the people living in them than we realized, that doesn't mean I don't want to build them in my city building games. While City Skylines wants to encourage players to build nice utopias for their citizens to live safe, healthy, and fulfilling lives in, I just want to make realistic cities, ugliness and all. That's not what City Skylines is about, and I recognize it's probably not the franchise to do that. But I at least want to make my kinda ugly, dysfunctional metro areas where people gotta commute from their run-down, low-density neighborhoods into the big city. Sadly, even that is not possible in vanilla City Skylines because citizens do not commute, they do not need parking, and all neighborhoods progress in a blistering process of gentrification simply because I did what the tutorial taught me to do in the first 20 minutes of the game. Now, don't get me wrong, I really do love this game. I'd consider it an easy contender for my top 10 favorite games of all time. It's just the right amount of neuron activation when I want something to relax to while I got some music or YouTube or a live stream playing. It's not a junk food game like Skyrim where my brain shuts off entirely. In fact, I get pretty into my cities once I've cleared my early game meta. But it can also be relaxing if that's the sort of experience you're after. There's a lot of ways to play CS. Sometimes you gotta mod the hell out of it, but we'll get back to that. Just a quick look at YouTube and Reddit reveals a diverse group from hardcore armchair civil engineers looking to build photorealistic cities, to casual players who find The Sims more to their liking and want to make a city with a story, and then you got the players who land in between. Then you got fans of classic city builders such as myself who enjoyed SimCity 4 and SimCity 2000 and SimCity, the one we don't talk about. That audience in particular had been starved so much by the demise of SimCity that Paradox finally greenlit Colossal Order's plans to make a proper, classic-inspired city building game, which then literally overnight took the spot of best city building game and has successfully held it for 8 years and counting. As I've been writing this script, Colossal Order has dropped a couple of gameplay trailers for City Skylines 2. Fortunately, I hadn't gotten too far with my CS2 wishlist because, as it turns out, CO seems to be systematically addressing most of what I was going to suggest. While certainly a pleasant surprise to have a trailer actually put me at ease and get me excited for the game, Bethesda, it did throw a bit of a wrench into what I wanted to do for this video. It's hard for me to hammer on the inadequacies of a game when the future game corrects them. I'm still going to be pointing those shortcomings out. This is a review of CS1 after all, and those shortcomings will likely always exist in it. I just wanted to slip this little disclaimer in because I'm sure I'll get some comments informing me that these issues are being addressed in CS2. Believe me, I'm well aware. I watched the trailers several times for this video, even going frame by frame for the first one. I'm going to be comparing CS1 a lot to Skyrim and Minecraft, which, okay, there's not a whole lot connecting these 3 games, but they are well known for being very moddable. Where Minecraft's mods transform its sandbox into something that actually resembles a game, CS's mods are a lot more conservative. Where Skyrim mods mostly focus on finishing the game for Bethesda and attempting to undo the damage their scalpel approach to systems design wrought, CS's mods usually work in tandem with what's already in the game to make a fuller experience. CS1 is one of my favorite games to mod because it's all additive, and also because the Steam Workshop makes it very easy to mod. It's not simply a platform for mods like the previous 2 games I mentioned. It's got a very solid foundation that's been present since day one. Its mods and DLCs merely add onto the refined classic city building formula that Colossal Order managed to nail so well. With all that said, 2 things to note. First, I'm going to be throwing around the term base game and vanilla game a lot. It's important to note that the game has received 8 years of patches that has added tons of free features and changed quite a bit. I played and recorded on the 1.16.1, 1.17, and 1.17.1 versions. These were the financial districts and hotels versions of the game. Any observations I make about features in the base vanilla game is based off of those versions. I don't think there's any legal way to get version 1.0 of CS1, and honestly, outside of some curiosity, I don't even know why anyone would want to play those versions. So I'm not going to go too crazy about comparing the current version to 1.0. Second, I did play a lot of this modded. I put over 120 hours into playing and recording 13 different cities for this video. Being a review for the PC version in 2023, it's safe to assume a lot of players picking this up now will be modding it at some point. I have a lot of experience with this game, both modded and unmodded, and I also have experience doing these sorts of videos for other games, modded and unmodded. I like to use mods in these sorts of videos to better demonstrate aspects of the vanilla game. For example, bringing up all the tweaks the Rebalanced Population Revisited mod makes to Citizen AI is a great way to highlight some of the counterintuitive design choices CO made there. I'm not including them to pad the runtime on the video that I want to keep brief to begin with, or to insinuate that the only way to enjoy this game is with 40 mods and 200 custom assets installed. I know there's people who just don't want to watch a review or an analysis video where the creator is running mods, and I get that, which is why I'm being upfront about it. If you're curious about the mods I'm running, go ahead and check the description below. Okay, well, seeing as we're already on the topic, how about we just start with discussing mods? CS1 is nowhere near perfect, and its quirks start to become more obvious the longer you play. These are the blemishes DLCs and especially mods have tried to cover up over the years. Interestingly though, despite its many flaws, there aren't any mods that I would consider essential. For a mod to be considered essential, I believe it needs to address something that is blatantly busted that only inhibits the player's experience whether they're a rookie or a vet. Skyrim's Sky UI is a great example of one. There's no worthwhile experience running Sky UI is going to deprive you of. No useful skills or knowledge is going to keep you from acquiring. Some people say Traffic Manager Presidential Edition is essential for CS1, but I've only recently installed it for this video and I still don't think it's a must-have. It offers you finer controls over your roads by letting you change turning lanes, ban certain traffic on certain roads, change speed limits, change the timing of traffic lights, and so much more. But I've always found this to be a band-aid fix for cities with suboptimal road layouts. If you want to make super realistic roads to support your city that's running the realistic population mod, then yeah, TMPE is almost essential. However, I've seen this mod being billed as something players should install right out of the gate, and I gotta disagree there. It's better to first learn how to build roads the game expects, then get all your traffic engineering mods to build the roads you want in the cities you really want to make. A mod like TMPE can end up teaching you to brute force certain road designs and city layouts. Rather than learning how to, say, properly isolate your industrial zones, you can just use TMPE and ban heavy traffic on every road leading into the adjacent residential zone. It's nice to have that freedom, but I still think it's a good idea to learn those lessons first. It looks like Colossal Order agrees, because from what we've seen of CS2 so far, they don't seem to have taken much from TMPE aside from some control over traffic lights and turning lanes. What they have copied are mods that I would almost consider essential, such as Picker, 81 Tiles, Road Anarchy, and Network Multitool. The Picker tool, or an eyedropper as it's more commonly known, is something CO has already integrated into the remastered console port of CS1. This just helps streamline the UI experience by letting players circumvent the UI entirely. Select something on the map and it instantly switches to the tool responsible for placing that object. 81 Tiles is a mod that lets players unlock the entire map to build upon. Alright, quick tangent because it's a hot button topic. Map size. The map in Cities Skylines is, in my opinion, quite large. Each map in the game is divided into tiles. These tiles measure 2 kilometers by 2 kilometers. The map is then divided into 9 by 9 tiles, hence 81 tiles. The vanilla PC game only allows you to unlock 9 of the 25 center tiles. The remastered console port lets you unlock all 25 center tiles. 81 tile mods lets you go all the way to the edge of the map, though things can get kinda weird out there and you're probably gonna want a mod that disables the fog at the edges of the map. I'm not sure why they didn't backport that 25 tile system to PC, but I guess the assumption was most players were installing mods that did that already anyways. However, Colossal Order's CEO did say a majority of players on PC never installed a single mod, so I don't really know. This starts to get into a debate over developers expecting modders to fix their games, but CO has been known to integrate popular modded fixes into CS1 via patches, so I'm more of the opinion not implementing 25 tiles was decided on for other reasons. Probably parity with the stated system requirements or some other pedestrian reason that the legal department flagged down. So if you do that math, 81 tiles times 4 square kilometers makes each map 324 square kilometers, or 201.324 miles for those viewers who love freedom. That looks like something like this if you're comparing a map in CS1 in New York City. Pretty big. Big enough to make a sprawling metro area? Not really. Big enough to build an intricate 1-to-1 city core though, or a scaled-down metro area? Yeah, I'd say so. While I wouldn't mind having bigger maps in CS2, I wouldn't say that should be the priority for the team. I'd rather have similar sized maps but much better performance, simulation speed, and AI, because those things always broke down long before I ever managed to fill the default 9 squares on a map. And that's on a PC well beyond the recommended system requirements. Instead, what I'd like to see are changes to the milestone and tile acquisition system and different map shapes. Let's start with shapes. If you measure a CS1 map from edge to edge, it measures out to be 18 kilometers, or 11.18 miles. How about, instead of forcing every map to be 9 by 9, we can stretch that thing all the way out to 81 by 1. That's 162 kilometers long, or just over 100 miles. Sure, you can't make big cities on that, but you could make a very long highway corridor with a bunch of small towns like you would see in rural parts of the US. Naturally, you should be able to make any dimensions you'd want with this proposed system. Maybe you could even get creative with how the tiles are laid out so that you can fit the surface space to match the contours of an area to cut out unwanted land or water. I have no idea if CO's systems could be able to even handle turning a game map into a sliding block puzzle, but I think this could be a good way to unlock more creativity in custom maps that don't require just making maps bigger. Then we got the milestone and tile acquisition system. As your city grows, you pass milestones. Each milestone unlocks new buildings, tools, and whatnot to add to your city and a little cash injection. Every so often, you are also given permission to purchase a new tile. I really take issue with the milestone system because it's only population-based, with each population-sized milestone being dictated by the amount of buildable land on the map. This puts low-population cities at a distinct disadvantage because the unlocks are gated very arbitrarily. Why can't my city of 2,000 people have bike lanes? Or what about airports? It's not uncommon for small rural towns to pop up around a tiny airfield, but that's just not possible in vanilla CS because the base airport requires a population near 40,000. This is done to create a progression system to the game so new players aren't overwhelmed with content, but as we'll get into in a bit, terrible tutorials screw this up as it is. There's a built-in mod players can access that will automatically unlock every milestone, but this has the effect of also removing the progression system from all the DLCs, and will give all the cash rewards for passing each milestone, resulting in players starting with tons of free cash. I like the idea of the milestone system, but I think we should have multiple paths to progress by passing milestones other than just growing our population. As well, rather than having fixed rewards, maybe we are rewarded with some kind of currency, and then we can spend that on unlocking what we really want instead. Really, all the system needs is some more flexibility. I also like the idea of having to purchase more plots of land, but I do think we should be able to purchase smaller tiles and non-adjacent tiles so that we could do something like purchase an interchange that's outside our city bounds, or acquire just the beach of a landmass and not the worthless body of water that occupies most of the tile. It looks like CS2 is decreasing the size of tiles and increasing the number of them, but there's still a lot to the new tile system we don't know about. Anyways, back to mods. Road Anarchy and Network Multi-Tool, I completely understand why they haven't been implemented into CS1. While these tools are useful for making the road building in this game much better, particularly freeways and junctions, they achieve a lot of that by pushing the road tools past their comfortable tolerances. Things can break very easily and spectacularly when you're using these mods, and they aren't the most intuitive tools to use either. CS1's roads are limited due to the game's engine, and it's clear there's not much more CO could have done to make them better outside of occasionally implementing a new tool via free updates. I'm not going to harp on all the quirks and frustrations of the road tools because the changes they made to them are front and center in the first gameplay trailers for CS2. They are rendering a lot of the functions of both of these mods obsolete by just making the base tools better, which is exactly what I wanted to see. Still, would be nice to see the auto curve, loop, and connection tools from Network Multi-Tool make their way into CS2. So, what's a player got to do to get themselves some true-to-life American cities in this game? Well, you got a mod. A lot. Alright, a quick bit of vocab. Mods, or more accurately custom content, are split into two major categories: mods and assets. Mods largely affect gameplay with new tools or tweaks to the game's systems. Assets are custom items usually made with the in-game asset editors. These are then broken down into themes, maps, district styles, scenarios, LUTs, vehicles, props, interchanges, and custom buildings. Custom buildings are then split into their own subcategories: growables and ploppables. Growables are just anything that will spawn when you zone something, and poppables are buildings ready to be placed down on the map. Themes and maps are related to one another. A theme is just a set of textures that a map will use, so you might see a custom map running a custom theme that turns the sand white. The base game includes 4 themes, sometimes called biomes: Temperate, Tropical, Boreal, and European. The Snowfall DLC added a 5th theme, Winter, which just adds snow and dynamic snowstorms to the game. I didn't have time to play a 14th city to test that DLC out, so this is the last time you're going to be hearing me talk about Snowfall and Winter maps. The European theme is an annoying one because, well, first off, European isn't a biome, and second, a recent update associates the European map theme with the European district style. A district style is just a collection of assets associated with one another that can be assigned to a city or an individual neighborhood to determine what sort of buildings will grow. On its own, the district style doesn't do anything and needs to have its associated assets installed with it. The European district style is also annoying because at some point it seems to have been merged with the default district style. Fortunately, there's some really good collections on the workshop that lets you download whole American-styled themes and their assets with a few clicks. You might have to modify them a bit. For that, I'd suggest the third-party mod manager SkyVE2 unsubscribe to anything you don't like because it makes the process much easier. Also, you'll probably want to download a few parking lot assets and maybe even pick up the parking lot road pack. It's a bit of an involved thing to build, but it is necessary to make those oceans of pavement you'll see in front of a Walmart. Then, of course, you got your quality of life mods like the road tools I mentioned earlier, some mods like the loading screen mod to make loading all these assets and mods quicker and more stable, and any UI and graphic mods you might want. Now we get into the big ones. Let's start with the realistic population mod. Colossal Order went out of their way to make a simulation system that was built upon every citizen on the map being persistent. They'll all have their own residence, their own place of employment, if they're employed, their own assigned schools, and it can even simulate them having friends they'll go visit. This allows citizens to live their own lives that the player can observe if they wish to, and is meant to create a more realistic feeling city. Unfortunately, that comes at a cost. Colossal Order could not have city populations be 1-to-1. A giant high-rise apartment won't have a few thousand people living in it, it might only have 20 or 30 residents. The store will not employ 60 to 100 people, it's only going to need 10 workers. Your downtown sidewalks aren't going to look like it's packed with people walking shoulder to shoulder, it might just have a cluster of 20 people walking at the same speed from the bus stop to the train station. Some players don't mind this, but others think this is a total deal breaker and have to mod the game so that the populations are more in line with reality. That ends up coming with a ton of its own headaches, like traffic AI breaking down or your game simulation speed slowing down to a crawl. Like I said earlier, if you run the realistic population mod, you're probably going to need other mods to make your life easier, like TMPE. Personally, I've never been bothered too much by the approximation CS city populations present, though they do feel a bit underwhelming now that I have a computer that can run laps around my PC from 2015. Like TMPE, I've never bothered to install the realistic population mod until this video because I knew about all the downsides to running it. The problem is that while the city populations are unrealistically low in vanilla CS, the suburban populations are way too high. You'll see single-family houses with 3 households totaling 15 people living in it, as though every ranch-styled house is a triplex. I believe this was done to keep the amount of sprawl with low-density residential to a minimum so that players can hit the appropriate population milestones to get out of the first couple of map tiles. With the realistic population mod and everything else I've listed, you've pretty much got what you need to start an American city. There's a few others I'd suggest though. You see, the game balance is still going to be all kinds of jacked up because of that population mod, and the AI just isn't going to behave rationally. Lifecycle Rebalanced Revisited, as I introduced earlier, tweaks a lot of background simulation settings. Honestly, this is a great mod even without the realistic populations mod because there's a bunch of design decisions behind CS simulations that just don't make a lot of sense. For instance, people moving into your city will always be at their lowest education level. So if you build a new housing development, it will always populate with uneducated citizens. I guess this is to smooth out the progression for commercial and industrial zones, but it's not at all realistic. Even worse, everyone moving into your city will already be an adult. This means if you get a huge influx of people all at once, they're all going to age together and die together. This is what triggers the dreaded death waves that can cause a city to spiral out of control for a few years. This mod adds some randomness to these systems to just make it more realistic and less dangerous to aggressively expand your population, which will happen if you're building a lot of high-rise apartments. It does a whole bunch of other things, but most relevant for making an American city, it adds transport preferences for different citizens depending upon what sort of residential housing they live in. People living in low-density housing will prefer to drive cars, whereas people living in high-density city cores will prefer to walk or take public transit. This is what gets us our commuters from outside the city core. Another mod worth looking at is Advanced Building Level Control, which lets you do things like lock a neighborhood to a certain building level range. This will prevent all your neighborhoods from leveling up and pricing out all your low-income citizens, keeping the character of your city intact. This is especially useful if you're trying to build a rural American area or a trailer park. You can also look at something like Ploppable Reco or Find It, which lets you search for specific growables to place by hand. I ended up downloading a bunch of assets of big box retailers like Walmart and Target so I could build giant strip malls, but I needed these mods in order to place them down and to get them to function like commercial buildings. Building levels are really important for progression in this game. Unfortunately, it's one of the more annoying features for many aesthetic city builders because it takes away their ability to control how their city looks. When you zone a new area, all buildings that first spawn will be at level 1. For residential zones, buildings cap out at a max level of 5. For most other zones, it's 3. A few odd specialized zones have only 1 or 2 levels, but we'll stay focused here. To level a building, you need to provide access to services and increase their property value. It's pretty much that simple, and that's why I said every city is destined to become a utopia, because providing basic services isn't really hard to achieve. Housing gets a little more complicated because people also need to be educated, but that just means providing them with elementary schools, high schools, and colleges, and just waiting for them to get educated. Once a building levels up, it gets torn to the ground and replaced by a new, fancier, and oftentimes bigger building. This can completely ruin the characteristics of a neighborhood that you spent a lot of time making to look a certain way, because the neighborhood turned into a field of level 5 skyscrapers when you had your back turned. The game does allow you to set a building as historical, which freezes the building's level. However, this is super tedious because in the base game, you need to do that for each building. The base game does include a district policy to prevent buildings from reaching their max level, but this highlights several more issues. First off, building height being tied to building level. This game struggles to give players good mid-rise buildings to smooth out the height progression between the max building level and the levels below it. This results in neighborhoods going from 10-floor apartments to 40-floor skyscrapers. Or how about 3-floor low-rises? Those also don't exist, so there's no way to make smooth transitions from low-density suburbs to dense city cores. Then you got wall-to-wall buildings being gated behind a DLC and not being implemented well, so it's difficult to get nice wall-to-wall districts. Fortunately, it seems CO is working really hard to address all of this in CS2. So instead, let's talk about districts and policies. Districts are a neat idea introduced in the base game at launch, and it's only seen more expansion and refinement over the years. The system allows you to paint zones on the map that you can then rename and apply policies and styles to. A lot of the DLCs would reuse the system to create their own districts that allowed you to place their associated buildings within. Policies, on the other hand, have been a staple in the city building genre for decades. These are modifiers and rules you can place on a district or a whole city to influence all kinds of things from tax, revenue, and social policies to traffic rules and industry regulations. I hardly use any of them because they are usually tied to a specific mechanic that could more easily be improved by increasing their respective budget in the budgets panel. The other reason I rarely mess with policies is because City Skylines is a very easy game. It doesn't take much to get a city going, and once you have a positive cash flow rolling, your city can pretty much run in perpetuity, assuming your landfills and cemeteries don't fill up or something. Even running out of money isn't a big deal because you're allowed to be in the red for a while before getting booted out of office. Likewise, ending up in the red is pretty hard to do. In the very early game, you'll want to watch what you build, manage your budgets, and raise your taxes up to their tolerated maximum of 11%, but once you end up with a positive cash flow, you probably will never see it go negative again. Then it's just a matter of waiting to build up a healthy account balance. You can switch to playing hard mode, but all that does is start you with less money, increase construction and maintenance costs on everything 25%, increase the cost of relocating buildings and reducing the refund for destroying buildings, reducing zoning demand, and decreasing building leveling speed. None of this directly affects citizen happiness, which is a seemingly forgotten game mechanic, even though it's prominently displayed on the toolbar. Everything from city services and traffic to taxes and local entertainment impact happiness. But you have to really try in order to drive the happiness down below the green smiling face. In fact, I think I've only seen the face change when I accidentally poisoned a city's water supply with raw sewage. Happiness doesn't seem to impact much, or at least not enough and not in any granular way. People are either happy and moving into the city or unhappy and moving out. We also get direct insight into what people are thinking via Chirper. Chirper was an attempt to bring SimCity's newspaper system up to the Web 2.0 era, which I find really ironic because it's a joke that aged like dog shit, because something Elon Musk, something there's also a SpaceX building. Where SimCity's newspapers felt like a charming and natural way to inform players of how they are doing because newspapers are kind of a timeless medium at this point, Chirper feels like a joke that was just never funny to begin with. Despite the ubiquitous disdain players have for the thing, surprisingly CEO has embraced Chirper and has made it their mascot for the franchise. Even more surprisingly, despite recent events, Chirper is going to be returning for CS2. The challenge in this game mostly comes from scale. The bigger your city gets, the more complex the solutions get for servicing the desires of your citizens. You might get into a situation where building a new housing development leads to traffic problems where your services are located, and suddenly you got dead bodies and trash piling up all over the city. This could be game over, but more often than not, there's a solution to the problem, be that building some new roadways, putting in some public transit, expanding services, or just bulldozing a neighborhood to eliminate traffic at the source. This forgiving approach to the game's difficulty is by design, and through 8 years of updates and DLCs, this organic difficulty has been maintained. While you'll find plenty of new players on Reddit posting pictures of their spaghetti road networks pleading for help to fix their chronic traffic problems, you'll also see plenty of seasoned players posting pictures of their perfectly optimized Utopias that pushes the game's engine to its limits because city populations were never meant to enter the 6-digit territory. It doesn't take long to get competent at the game, however, getting good really depends upon the player's ability to plan ahead. Well, that and just getting good at working around CS's quirks with its finicky tools. But what I'd say really separates the good players from the competent players is one's overall ability to execute on a grand vision for a city. Arguably, the best way to play this game is to start a city with a specific goal. Build a big highway network, make a nice skyline, minimize car traffic, or just design a pretty city on a custom map you found on the Steam Workshop. Even just booting up a flat empty map and trying to make a perfectly optimized megacity is a good way to have some fun. However, as I mentioned in the beginning, issues start to arise when your vision exceeds what the game will naturally allow. And it doesn't really take much to do that. Just try making an American city. I didn't sit here listing mods for 20 plus minutes because I want to be able to call this a mod showcase in the video description. I just wanted to demonstrate how much work it really might take just to get this game to begin to cooperate with certain city designs. So I ended up with 3 major city projects that pursued the elusive American city. There were others, but some modding oopsies and a custom map I made led to their failure to launch. The first one I made actually predates the American City mod list I put together for my final 2 cities. The game offered up the fitting city name of Las Vegas for this one, a cursed name for a cursed city. If you caught any of the live streams I did, then you're going to be familiar with this one. It was part test bed for building the mod pack, part guinea pig for some roadway layout ideas, and part post for the state of Florida. Had I known at the time just how cursed some of the developments in Florida actually are, I would have stepped my game up because even the worst development I cooked up was much more habitable than some of Florida's sprawling suburbs. This one was not running the realistic population mod and it did not start with all the milestones unlocked, so I had to go through my usual early game routine. For this one, I got a lot more creative with my low-density residential starting square as I messed with some road grid ideas. The plan was to make most things on the starting tile permanent, so the low-density residential developments would stay low-density, for the most part. I figured the industrial section would eventually migrate as they tend to do when my city grows and my citizens get educated and prefer to work in offices rather than factories. I also knew the highway would have to reach further inland, so I did a lot of land reservation for future infrastructure projects, as opposed to doing what I normally do, which is channeling my inner Robert Moses and bulldozing entire neighborhoods to lay down essential highways. Fortunately, one of my other objectives for the city played to this idea, and that's that this city was going to be a heavy tourism city so that I could test out the new hotels DLC. This meant I had to expand towards the coast where the beachfront was located, so this starting tile was actually on the outskirts of that future city, as opposed to being on the ideal tile for building a city core. This city was built in the Asanu beach map, which is a Colossal order special made for the airport's DLC. It's a flat map with an absurdly large beach that requires a lot of tile purchases to acquire. The river that cuts through the southern quadrant of the map is also poorly made, as they just cut into the land with the level tool and spammed water spawners. This is the lazy way to make a river that results in something really unnatural looking. As a result, this was destined to be the industrial corridor, even though the river didn't have shipping access for some reason. After I had a nice low-density residential core that got me a few milestones deep into the progression so I could build high density, I did a live stream where I made the most artificial development I could think of based off of gated communities I've seen in real life. These are places that seem to be walkable, but glaring flaws like being cut in half by a busy arterial road or an isolated commercial district that prioritizes parking, or sidewalks with no trees in a city that's routinely hitting 90 degrees, ends up actually encouraging driving. It also featured plenty of cul-de-sacs, no cut-through roads, or even footpaths to make getting anywhere convenient, and an ugly waterfront development whose view was blocked by copy-pasted palm trees and a giant elevated highway across the river. Of course, the land value was super high, so people love to live there. I tried to build a giant strip mall on the cheaper side of the development, but I lacked the parking lot and commercial assets to really do it justice. I did use the warehouse buildings from the Industries DLC to simulate the truck traffic you'd see from one of these major commercial developments. Of course, we got that traffic squeezed onto the same 2-lane residential road the offensively ugly, ultra-modern, high-capacity elementary school from the Green Cities DLC was located on. We even added the only bike lane in the entire city on this one strip of roadway for added fun. If this game had simulated fatalities for pedestrians, this would probably have been the deadliest strip in the city. I want to clarify because I'm afraid some people still won't get it. This development was intentionally made to be awful. It was a joke that turned out to be a lot of fun to build on stream. It also turned out to be one of the more successful parts of the city. I have no explanation for why that is the case. However, dunking on overpriced gimmicky suburban developments was only one objective for this city. The second was getting it to embrace Florida's tourist and college kid-friendly vibes. I moved on to building a campus DLC trade school on some troublesome foothills that would not have been suitable for any serious urban development. The college refused to take off though, and I have a couple of suspicions as to why. So, city services in this game are tied to buildings you plop down along a road. The effective range of these services are based on the surface radius of those buildings and the road network around it. I've always found the default radius for most service buildings in this game to be way too small. Like, just look at the service range for the vanilla elementary school. No joke, you need an elementary school every 3 blocks to service a neighborhood that's laid out on the most efficient grid. If you're building bigger grids, or God forbid, winding roads, you need to spam these schools everywhere. The assets also kinda suck because they lack any parking, any place for buses or parents to deposit students, or even any playgrounds or fields. Maybe European schools look like this, but over here in America, schools have the footprint of a strip mall. I used to use a mod that would let me edit the internal stats for buildings, but the mod has been abandoned, and the update for hotels finally killed it off for good. Instead, I downloaded a pack of extended range surface buildings that the author also modified to at least add some parking and playgrounds to the schools. You can extend the range of buildings by increasing their associated budgets, but that's usually more expensive, less effective, and less precise than just plopping more buildings. So my 2 theories for why the college campus never got off the ground is that either A, the network it was attached to wasn't efficient enough to give it a big service radius, or B, the campus didn't have enough buildings and stuff on it to make it attractive for citizens to enroll in, even though the only other college in town was a little community college I got off the workshop. I read online that you cannot get things like foreign exchange students or out-of-state college students who come in for a semester and leave during the holiday breaks. This would mean you're entirely dependent upon the city residents attending your big fancy campus college. I don't really know how I would be able to go around testing this, but needless to say, you're going to be relying on your city students to float your college anyways. Sad to say, the Oliver Career Institute with its police academy never got far enough to let me build the tourism-boosting hospitality school. After that, I started aggressively expanding the city population with a big, high-density city core following a major highway redevelopment and expansion program. Sadly, the highway came up short because I underestimated just how many highways almost every major US city has. So after a while, this thoughtful grid layout broke down from constant gridlock traffic. Even a robust rail network with a major train hub that stretched to the farthest edges of the city couldn't alleviate the traffic. Despite the terrible traffic being made worse from a massive bus network that was now clogging up roads where several popular bus lines converged to share the same bus stops, I decided to launch the tourism program. This meant building up a commercial district that only made the traffic worse, and developing that unrealistically huge beach into a recreational area with hotels, restaurants, and entertainment. First, I had to build a long winding road down the hillside to the beach itself, where I dropped down a harbor so tourists could start entering my city. A decision I thought was going to be rather innocuous at the time until the passenger ships started rolling in. At a rate of about a dozen at a time, the passenger ships queued up in the harbor, stacking on top of one another at times, and depositing their handful of travelers even though these ships have a capacity of over 100. With no public transit in sight, the travelers pulled out their trusty pocket cars and drove into the new beachfront district to crowd onto the custom beach asset I got off the workshop because the base game doesn't have any functional beach parks. But then, why does the Colossal order map? This, of course, made traffic worse in the city core. Even with a direct train line to the harbor and dedicated bus routes, many tourists still insisted on using their pocket cars to get around. Fortunately, the hotel and entertainment district that didn't look right because the dedicated tourism district only grows high-rises was close enough that many travelers began opting to walk the long sun-drenched strip of road in the 90-degree heat. Maybe those travelers were dropping dead on the side of the road, and that's why the restaurants along the road were constantly complaining about not having enough customers. During another stream, we had the wonderful idea to try and build Disney World. Unfortunately, Parklife's theme park offerings wasn't enough to even build what would be an acceptable county fare, so we had to settle on discount Six Flags. It eventually got its singular roller coaster and chat was very disappointed. It also never made a profit because I had other city parks that were raking in the cash and cannibalizing discount flags as ticket sales. By this point, the game was getting really sluggish, most likely because of all the traffic problems. As well, my attempts to get past a 2-star rating with my hotel chain was going nowhere. In a last-ditch effort to save Las Vegas, I finished the last of my ambitious highway projects. Then I converted a useless hilltop into a custom airport whose terrain leveling tool broke the geometry and made it so that I couldn't delete the decorative boulders that had been scattered around by the map designer at Colossal Order. We made an airport that conformed to the meta by resembling a parking lot, and I triggered some viewers in chat because they didn't know the one-way taxiways were actually bi-directional when terminated with an airline gate. Then I retired Las Vegas to build the next version of the mod pack. One of the reasons I reverted my game to a pure vanilla state without any mods, custom assets, or even any DLCs was to get a sense of how the game onboards new players. This led me down an insightful but otherwise uneventful series of cities that I really didn't play for too long. Cities Skylines is a tragically interesting game when it comes to its UI. The designers were obviously trying to find a balance of presenting information while keeping things clean so as not to overwhelm the player. This leads to certain things being obfuscated or locked behind an inaccessible UI until you meet an arbitrary requirement, or just not explained at all. The UI has gotten noticeably less functional as the years have gone on and the amount of content the game has expanded. With all the DLCs installed, the UI just breaks down almost entirely. They tried to come up with different solutions by implementing sub-tabs and filters, but that only further confuses things because they were haphazardly implemented. Everything on the main toolbar is organized horizontally. This results in a ton of scrolling left and right to find the things that you want. Not a big deal when playing purely vanilla, but with the DLCs and mods installed, things like the road category become almost unusable. Several mods have surfaced to try to address this issue mainly due to this one category, but I've yet to find one that does a perfect job. As well, many popular mods populate the toolbar with more buttons, and so my modded UI is just a nightmare. Maybe one day CS1 will get its Sky UI equivalents, but so far that hasn't happened. Then you have things that are seemingly tossed into different parts of the UI with no rhyme or reason. Where do you think the plazas from the Pedestrian Plazas DLC can be located? In the dedicated plaza tab of the park category? Nope, that only has 3 of this game's many plazas. The Pedestrian Areas tab of the park category? Once again, nope. It's one over from that in the Pedestrian Area Plazas tab. Also, keep in mind a lot of plazas are located in the Unique Buildings category because they are unique buildings that can only be built once per city. Also, why are there roads in the Parks category? Why are the Pedestrian DLC assets even located in the Parks category at all? It's got a decent number of parks, sure, but the services are also thrown in with them. I could go through all of these categories and cite literally dozens of examples like this. This game really needed someone to just go through and rationalize its UI now that we got all these DLCs in the game. Frankly, there's a lot of cleaning up and balancing that the game could have used to smooth over the rough edges introduced by the DLCs. Being familiar with other Paradox games, I've grown accustomed to bloated UIs, especially ones bloated by DLCs that continue to have their elements carelessly bolted on. I can't decide on whether CS is the most benign UI gore I've seen in a PDX title or the worst. Where EU4's UI requires hours-long tutorials to learn, most things are at least logically placed. CS1's UI is more readable and doesn't require a system of nested tooltips, but it's completely illogical in a lot of its categorization. It looks like Colossal Order has done a decent job overhauling the UI for CS2 by using more vertical screen space, reducing redundancy, and overall just making it more consistent. My concern mainly rests in what happens when DLC and mods start getting added to that game. CS1's UI was really solid when it launched. It was years of DLC bloat that made it buckle. Thing is, CS1 was a game that launched with several asset creators right out of the gate, so if they were unable to address what was going to be an issue like this back then for a PC exclusive, I question how well they are future-proofing CS2's UI. So far, CS2's UI looks like it's just a reset of CS1's, which is fine, but it's going to take a lot of conscientious decisions on their part to maintain it as they roll out DLCs. Another special mention goes to the mods and custom assets part of the main menu UI. I find this page equal parts great and frustrating. As an avid mod and custom asset user, I'd really like to see this screen overhauled in CS2. First, we got the positives. Its integration with the Steam Workshop is really quite good, with it allowing you to go directly to Workshop pages. It will warn you if there's something potentially wrong with a mod, and it also allows you quick access to mod settings. Seriously, coming from a game like Minecraft, having a standardized way to tweak mod settings in-game is awesome. You can even install and uninstall content while the game is running, and this screen will update. The limitations of this menu are most apparent in the custom assets screen. Nothing is categorized, despite it being categorized on the workshop. Assets take up way too much screen space with tons of empty space, and just doing anything in bulk is a huge pain. This isn't the biggest issue if you only have 20 custom assets installed, but if you start getting into custom district styles, this menu becomes completely unusable. Seeing as it's related to the UI, let's talk about the in-game tutorials. In short, they're pretty awful. One of the reasons I wanted to play purely vanilla was to see how the tutorials worked now, and I was surprised when I was seeing some references to DLCs I didn't even have installed. Really though, the main issues come down to how brief the tutorials are and how they are presented. The game has several places it will explain things. The most prominent is the advisor located as a question mark on the toolbar. Then there's pop-ups that will highlight parts of the UI with some text offering suggestions to the player. These can also be reviewed from the pause menu. Then there's tooltips that sometimes can be found by hovering over a UI element. And finally, different buildings, districts, panels, and whatever else will sometimes have descriptions that also explain things. These are all fine ways to introduce players to new things or refresh their memory or just offer more detail on something. But like other parts of the UI, this is all carelessly done, leading to fragmentation of information and lots of confusion. One of the biggest issues I had was with the advisor. You have to open it and leave it open because it's contextual based on the tools and panels you have open. Going back to the road tool, the advisor wastes an entire paragraph explaining toll booths, a feature players don't even have unlocked at the beginning, instead of explaining the different road tools themselves. It shows pictures of those tools, but nothing else. It also doesn't explain the snapping or zoning controls, which were post-launch additions, but they're still something worth explaining now. They updated these messages for the DLCs, so why didn't they update it with stuff that's in the base game now? The contextual nature of the advisor is fine when it's acting as a reminder, but as a teaching tool, it's pretty terrible, and that's because there's no flow to its tutorials. You're expected to just open every tool, panel, and whatever else and read what the advisor has to say. This is like a professor that hands you a textbook and tells you to read the whole thing and that there's going to be a test on it at some point. Some people can learn like that, but typically something like this isn't just meant to be an encyclopedia of knowledge, but also a guide through that knowledge. But even as an encyclopedia, the advisor still fails. One of the best examples I have of that is when I realized while recording for this video that I never learned how to zone properly. So, zoning in this game is grid-based. When you lay down a strip of roadway, it will automatically paint a grid that's 4 units deep, assuming there's no obstructions or overlapping with other grids. Already we're into things that the tutorial didn't explain, but it's intuitive enough to figure out through gameplay. There's tricks you can learn to maximize space and best practices you'd want to adopt when laying down something like a curved road. This would be some good stuff to put into an in-game encyclopedia, maybe even with some videos, but I guess we need to keep the tutorial YouTubers employed. Based on what the tutorial had taught me and the elements of the UI, I always took to making my standard road grids 8 units wide. Then I'd just paint zones whole blocks at a time. I knew to avoid zoning entire districts to prevent death waves, but zoning demand does a good job of quietly encouraging that behavior anyways. What I didn't know was that I was essentially leaving it up to the game to figure out how big the lots for individual buildings were going to be. Once again, I knew zoned growable buildings had different lot sizes, such as 1x1, 2x2, 2x4, 4x2, etc. The biggest lot is 4x4, and as it turns out, if you do what I was doing and let the game handle deciding what lot sizes to use, it's going to go for building the biggest footprints possible. This can lead to many growables never appearing, especially if you're building a standardized, maximized grid layout. So for 8 years, I've been getting really homogeneous looking cities, and I had no idea why until I started messing with different grid configurations and zoning lots by hand. So rather than painting whole blocks solid, I'd do alternating patterns, let buildings grow, then fill in the gaps. This not only completely changed the way my cities looked, but it also changed how my cities played. I found myself in much more control over the growth of my cities' populations because some lot sizes are a lot more space efficient than others. 1x1s in particular are kinda OP, especially with low density residential, making them a little controversial in the community. I used to rush through the early game by spamming an entire starting square with low density residential on grids designed for the high density units I'd rezone it as later. When I learned how to properly use the tools, I found out that I could get through the early game quicker by building more efficient low density developments. This also had the benefit of letting me build more unique and aesthetically pleasant middle density developments I didn't even know were possible to make. In short, I realized I'd basically been playing the game wrong for 8 years because the in-game tutorials didn't explain how its tools worked. Experienced players can take it for granted that they can intuit a lot of these things now, but I'm imagining a new player picking this up and immediately being overwhelmed by all the tools the advisor doesn't really explain. I mean, I still don't really know what the difference between the curve tool and the free build tool is. But then we get the higher level concepts like all the nuances of traffic management that the game doesn't even call attention to. I don't expect it to explain step by step how to build a functional traffic-free city. Figuring that out is part of the fun after all, but I was surprised how little the opening tutorial even calls attention to the fact that I should be thinking about future traffic problems now. This is one of the reasons so many new players struggle with traffic. Well, that and the unintuitive quirkiness of driver and pedestrian AI. Then we get to the tutorial pop-up messages. I wouldn't mind just how obnoxious and overbearing they were if they weren't actively giving bad advice. Once again, there's no flow to how they appear. They just pop up once you unlock a new thing after hitting a certain population threshold. The main issue is that you unlock a lot of stuff in this game, especially if you have all the DLC. Most of those things you aren't going to be planning on using for a while, if at all. The pop-ups don't care about your plans though. They just want you to plop the new thing down right now. You can close them out, but it's only going to wait a few minutes before reminding you about that new thing again that you really should plop it down. When it comes to mandatory services like police and fire coverage, yeah, that's a good idea, but you'll learn the urgency of those services anyways when you start seeing buildings drowning in trash and burning to the ground. The game was very insistent that I start building the childcare and elder care facilities I unlocked. I usually ignore those until much later in the game because they are an expensive and non-essential service. Honestly, I usually ignore health services in general for a while because oddly enough, hospitals aren't an essential service in this game. Sure, I might be burying a few more citizens, but that's the cost of building a budget surplus quickly. That metro system isn't going to pay for itself, you know. So I didn't appreciate the game telling me to redline my finances just because it wanted me to build some post-launch buildings that were arbitrarily gated behind a population milestone. Needless to say, I never built the facilities, I just disabled the pop-ups and moved on. I didn't spend much time playing vanilla, and that's because mods and DLCs don't really alter the fundamental experience of base city skylines. We don't have mods adding new game modes or mechanics, and stuff DLC introduces is supplemental content that can, and really should, be experienced a la carte. The bulk of the experience remains pretty much the same, as opposed to something like a skill tree overhaul in Skyrim. Reverting to a pure vanilla state with City Skylines sort of surprised me. There's a lot of content and gameplay in the out-of-the-box experience. Comparing it to my heavily modded version, I'd say more than 2/3 of the experience was the same, and that's a good thing and a bad thing. Taken positively, it's the marker for a solid foundation. Taken negatively, those paid DLCs don't really add much to the game. For a DLC to be considered essential, I think it needs to either correct something that was fundamentally broken or poorly designed in the base game, or offer an experience that, without it, would diminish the overall experience of the game. While I don't think it's the job of modders to fix a game, I do believe it's the job of the developer to do so. Fortunately, nothing in CS1 is fundamentally broken. The game is actually pretty stable and bug-free. Performance and AI are probably this game's biggest technical sore spot, and some mods have managed to tidy that up a bit, but it's clear these issues are mostly products of the modified Unity engine CO built for this game. While we haven't gotten any info on the AI in CS2, it stands to reason they're going to address issues like AI not saturating the lanes on a roadway correctly or the ship stacking I showed earlier. The discussion for these DLCs as content, on the other hand, isn't so cut and dry. There were some serious weak spots in the launch version of CS the developers needed to focus their attention on. Transit options, basic city services, city aesthetics, and city purpose were all things the base game lacked quite a bit. Fortunately, that's mostly what the DLCs focused on. The problem is in the execution and value of those attempts. If you go to the store page for City Skylines, you'll see there's 62 DLC items listed there totaling $395 US. 3 of those items are free, so that's actually 59 items totaling $395 US. Colossal Order and their publisher Paradox Interactive have been heavily criticized for this monetization scheme for years now. Sad to say, City Skylines isn't even the worst offender of this because it's not a $40 game with $445 of DLC that you can rent for $5 a month, but it's still pretty egregious. A lot of CS's DLCs are content packs outsourced to members of the community, which are, put bluntly, paid mods. In principle, I don't have an issue with paid mods, but that's assuming those mods are better than the free stuff. Maybe it's because I felt robbed by Skyrim's Creation Club content, but while I was willing to buy every City Skylines expansion and mini expansion for this video, I really could not justify buying all the content creator packs and radio stations. I decided on a compromise and simply bought the 2 content creator map packs because it'd be easier for me to judge their quality as opposed to custom district assets that I'd have to load in and zone for. If these DLCs were priced around $5 a piece, I'd probably be much more charitable, but most of them land in the $13 to $15 range, with the content packs being around $5. Even at their lowest discounts of 50% off, I'd still say most of these DLCs aren't really worth it. Maybe I'm stuck in the past remembering what I was able to get out of DLCs back in the day, but calling any of these expansions is a serious stretch of the definition. discussion. I think a fair way to judge their value is comparing the content you get from them to the content of the base game. With the base game being $30, it's safe to say you are not going to be getting half of the base game's content with these things. If I had to quantify it, I'd say even the beefiest DLCs are about 5% of the base game's content overall. Then you throw in the fact that these things have to compete with free mods, and yeah, the value calculus really doesn't look so good. Some might cope and say they did the right thing making the base game only $30 and making the money on the back end, but remember, this game outsold their sales target by 40 times, clocking in at 12 million units as of last year, and the next game is priced at $50. It's more likely they saw that they could charge more for what they were making, and so they are. Okay, but maybe the content is limited, but the stuff it adds is great. No. I've really grown to like tier lists for these sorts of discussions in videos, so here you go. A tier list of all the paid DLCs I bought for the video. Please note that the list starts at B tier because this game does not have any A or S tier DLCs. For something to be A tier, it would have to be essential, and S tier is something so good it justifies buying the base game just to experience, like the Shivering Isles for TES 4 Oblivion. The stuff at the top of this list was good enough to either have some of its content parceled off in free patches become part of the base game, like some of Mass Transit's networks, or just being made standard in City Skylines II, like Industries. The B's and C's are solid bonus content to the base game, but none of it's essential, and they're all marred by very poor balancing and integration. Basically, don't be surprised if your city starts making tons of cash because you built something from one of these DLCs. Also, these ones do the most damage to the UI, so beware of that too. D's are the take it or leave it stuff. Aside from the map pack, they do add unique gameplay, and if that's something you're looking for, this is really the only way you're going to be getting it. F is just trash, even discounted is not worth it, and F- I wish I could have gotten refunds on. I'm not going to go through all the DLCs, but I'll touch on a few so that we aren't just leaving this whole section up to a stupid tier list I made as a joke. We'll start with the map packs because I was honestly surprised how good they were. I figured I was just throwing money away on these things. After all, free maps are a dime a dozen on the workshop. The first pack, made by community member Sanctum Gamer, was pretty decent. The mixed reviews on the Steam page made me apprehensive, and there only being 8 maps and hardly any pictures or info on the sales page also didn't inspire confidence. I wouldn't exactly call these the cream of the crop compared to some of the free workshop maps I've played, but they were still leagues ahead of anything Colossal Order themselves have put together. Seriously, this game's base maps are, pretty terrible. Visually, they are bland. Gameplay, they have annoying things like being arbitrarily divvied up by the tile system, and their transit networks are just awful. You will have to replace all the highway interchanges on the map because they will jam up with traffic. The maps you get with the DLCs are honestly not much better, which makes considering them an added value to each expansion dubious. It's pretty clear they did not have a dedicated map maker on the team. My question then is why they didn't just outsource the DLC maps to the community like the content creator packs. You know, seeing as they were technically charging for these maps too. Anyways, the first pack was alright. If I had to do it again, I'd probably not pick it up, but at least I didn't want a refund. I tried looking Sanctum up on the game's workshop considering they're said to have come from the community, but I couldn't find any of their creations. I'm guessing they left the community and pulled down their creations at some point, leaving their pack as the only stuff of theirs left. The second pack featured 10 maps by community creator Sidai, and this pack actually had some of the best maps I've ever played in it. The generic-sounding River Plains map is a genuine banger that supports a multitude of city styles. You get the best mileage out of it with an 81 tile mod, but I imagine it also plays very well even with 9 tiles. The map is beautiful, there's tons of space to spread out, there's some little nooks on the edges of the map that can let you get creative, the transit networks are perfect, and it even has an appropriate shipping lane on the main river. Sidai I was able to find in the workshop, and they're still making free maps, many of them 100% vanilla, so no mods needed to run them. I booted up a couple and it looks to be up to snuff with what I saw in the map pack. So yeah, here's a paid mod I actually felt warranted its price tag. Some of the maps in the pack felt a little gimmicky, like the map was designed with a very specific sort of city layout in mind, so some points off for those, but I played almost exclusively on these maps while recording this video because they were consistently great. Mass transit is a hard one to really define because it doesn't add any new gameplay per se, opting instead to just expand the transit networks and add a few new ones. It's probably the closest one I'd consider to be essential, especially if you're like me and download a ton of custom highway interchanges on the workshop. But like I said, its best parts have been getting parceled out over time into free updates. In a similar vein, Green Cities also opts for a shotgun approach to beefing up a bunch of city services and policies. It's got a lot of unique stuff in there that I've hardly, if ever seen mods do, and it's integrated well with the game and not terribly imbalanced to make the green options best in slot. Another one I'd almost consider essential and a decent value on sale. Campus and Industries are two that seem to just be getting integrated right into base CS2, which is good to hear. Both DLCs rely on painting dedicated districts and then building those districts up with ploppable buildings. The Industries DLC includes things like oil extraction and refinement, mining, forestry, and agriculture. Meanwhile, the Campus DLC is split between a trade school, a liberal arts college, and a major university. They're fun and flexible alternatives to the systems and buildings they're meant to replace in the base game that helps add purpose and variety to a city. However, they both lack a lot of depth and are poorly balanced. In the case of Industries, it's easy to pad a city's economy with even a half-assed industry. Non-renewable resources will deplete over time in the base game, but even still, Industries are pretty wild. It'll be nice to see these things get a second pass in CS2, but they really should have at least rebalanced them in CS1 so that I could have considered them A tiers. Park Life and Plazas and Promenades are two DLCs beefing up the same section of the game, and that's Parks and Plazas. Parks in the base game can feel very gamey with you being forced to just drop them where you got space to boost property value and tourism. Maybe you'll get a little crazy and do some landscaping to integrate them better into the neighborhood or make some custom parks in the asset creator, but parks, and their often neglected counterpart plazas, were very restrictive and added to the cookie-cutter feeling vanilla cities can have. Both DLCs address this by giving free-form tools and buildings to design more unique spaces and adding some new gameplay. While these two DLCs were released 4 years apart, I feel like they really would have been a better value together. At least bundling Park Life with Plazas and Promenades with a discount would have helped. Once again, they're pretty OP, with Parks letting you rake in tons of unearned cash and Plazas letting you literally ignore gameplay mechanics when designing a walkable city. As already said with Las Vegas, theme parks and zoos can feel very skimpy with the attractions you're allowed to build. Natural Disasters is one of the earlier DLCs for Skylines, and it was well regarded by players who missed being able to wipe out their cities like they could in SimCity. Personally, I've never cared for kicking down my own sandcastles, so Disasters doesn't really do it for me. It adds some mechanics like city evacuation, search and rescue crews, and early detection systems, but I found the random disasters happen too frequently and they weren't really even that big of a deal to warrant setting up evac routes and stuff like that. I ended up turning them off in the settings just because they were more annoying than challenging and fun. Speaking of things I disabled, day-night cycles and dynamic weather were both features I've always kept disabled. These were things added for free with the After Dark and Snowfall expansions respectively. The problem with both of these features is that I just can't see anything when it's nighttime or it's raining. That's kind of a big issue in a game where you're constantly building and examining small details in the city. In fact, I've also disabled clouds and fog with a mod. All of these things look alright when I'm touring my city, but they really get in the way when I'm just trying to build things. Financial Districts is pretty terrible in some really unique ways. It adds a stock exchange with its own stock trading minigame that really lives up to a saying I once heard that goes, the best way to make $2 million is to start with $1 million. If you got the cash to throw into the market, you can make stupid money very quickly by just buying stuff when it's red and selling it a few seconds later when it's green. There's no strategy, and even though the market says the stocks are influenced by conditions in your city, I found I was not able to manipulate the price of the traffic stock by cutting down the budget for public transit. Financial districts are supposed to help make your office districts generate more tax revenue, but I found that was washed out by the high operating costs for the associated unique buildings. Then we got banks, but all these do is help reduce crime in commercial districts by providing armored trucks to transport money in. The banks are even listed in the law enforcement buildings category. For those of you unaware, banks rarely deal in the transport of cash. That's usually the job of a security firm. But I guess making a system that simulates a mortgage market was beyond the scope of this DLC. The only positive I have is that the financial district office specialization is a great way to get some downtown Manhattan vibes. Airports is shockingly bad. This was the first DLC Colossal Order released after a 2-year break due to COVID. As a result, the DLC was developed while they were transitioning to work from home, so I guess that explains it. However, they're charging $13 for this piece of shit, and that's insane when there's free collections of custom assets that look better, function better, and are easier to use that predate this DLC. I wouldn't expect CO to make a full airport management game as DLC, but the fact that you can't make any money off your airport until you start your own airline speaks volumes to how thought out the gameplay for this DLC was. Once again, if you're unaware, airports usually don't start their own airlines, but instead make their money off of charging other airlines to use their facilities, charging rent for shops and vendors, and nickel and diming travelers for parking and baggage. Almost every DLC I've talked about up until this point has had a leveling system to it. Most things you build in these DLCs, be it city parks, industrial parks, campuses, or shopping malls, all have a level progression system based on all sorts of mostly arbitrary benchmarks. Usually it's trivial to max something out. This, of course, begs the question of why have the leveling system at all? It ends up needlessly locking you out of things you might want, which can force you to do a lot of rebuilding once you unlock everything. CS2 seems to be refining the idea by offering a modular upgrade system that won't require lots of rebuilding or meta-knowledge of what you'll be unlocking in the future. Airports is this issue taken to its most extreme. I spent over an hour building my first airport, only for it to quickly reach its max 3rd level. After getting access to buildings I liked more, I was forced to tear the whole thing down and start from scratch. And most of the buildings are really just props that don't do anything except boost the aesthetic score of the airport. Even the hotels do nothing but look pretty, which is funny because then they released a dedicated hotels DLC that doesn't have any integration with the airport DLC. The act of building an airport is also really tedious. Runways and taxiways are this DLC's roads, and it's almost funny how they exhibit every annoying quirk roads have, but to an extreme degree. Runways only have 4 access points, 2 entry points and 2 exit points at either end of the runway. You cannot add an on or off ramp along different lengths of the runway, so smaller aircrafts don't have to run down the entire length of a runway designed for bigger aircrafts. The DLC has a minimum runway length you need to lay down, which is way too short for even the smallest aircrafts, but it doesn't have any suggestions for a comfortable runway length for larger crafts. This can result in you placing comically long runways, or runways that are so short the planes have to pull impossible maneuvers to get off the ground. Well, actually, they'll do that regardless of length, making the added length pointless. Also, you cannot intersect runways, which is something you'll see often at just about any decent-sized airport, or even some of the airports in the mass transit DLC. This is because we don't actually have an air traffic control in this game to direct aircrafts during takeoff and landing, so things have to be controlled by the 2 networks we have to play with. Taxiways make up the second half of airports as added networks. They're a single one-way road that are a huge pain to work with because of how janky they are. This is due to how their nodes are handled. Network nodes are points along a network that act as control points of sorts for them. They're used for all sorts of internal logic by the game's simulations, but the most visible aspect for the player is that roadways like to make intersections at nodes. Certain roads and angles will interact with nearby nodes in different ways, and this is one of the main culprits for CS1's finicky road building mechanics. Taxiways are heavily biased towards making intersections at nodes, but sometimes they will refuse to make an intersection at said node. Or sometimes you want to make an intersection just before or after a node, but the taxiway simply won't allow it. And there's no reason for this limitation because I used the network multi-tool mod to delete the troublesome nodes, and the taxiways would then draw their intersections just fine. Without this mod, and frankly even with it, making nice, clean-looking taxiways is next to impossible. It's definitely not a straightforward task, made even more frustrating by how taxiways interact with aircraft gates. All of this adds up to a frustrating and disappointing experience where I just end up making the airport however the game would allow me to, and not to the plan that I had in my head. The very limited props and decals only made building nice looking airports even more challenging. And once it's all set, you'll never want to look at the airport again because of how the airplane's janky pathfinding works during takeoff and landings. My second major American city project for this game was to do something a lot more rural and industry focused. I had a certain vibe in my head for this city, or county, because this is going to be a series of smaller towns, so I decided to dive into the map editor for this one. I spent about 10 hours total working on the map of Lakeview, which, as its name suggests, was intended to feature a lake. I have a decent amount of experience with the map editor from over the years, but I started exclusively going for maps on the workshop for 2 reasons. First, I was spending more time making maps and installing mods than I was actually playing the game. Second, I was just not very good at making maps. So this was my attempt to further my goal of becoming a pro CS player for this video by getting good with the map editor. In that regard, I think I actually learned a lot. Not much worth putting into this video, but I definitely acquired a new appreciation for community map creators. I've seen them say how their maps can take weeks to make, and I absolutely can see why. The tools for the map editor are simple but versatile. While the map of Lakeview was supposed to mainly feature a lake, its real defining feature ended up being the mountains that surrounded it. After failing to convert a height map of Morgantown, West Virginia into a playable map in the editor, I decided to make something from scratch that still felt like West Virginia. I didn't really succeed there, but I was a little proud that I figured out how to make different types of mountains with these tools. While they are more versatile than you'd expect, the landscaping tools in the editor are still very limited. Like, even SimCity 4 had dedicated tools for making mountains. In City Skylines, you gotta mess with the raise lower terrain tool, swap to different brushes, which you can load custom ones into the game, and use the smooth tool to simulate erosion. It is satisfying to see the shape of real geological formations begin to form while getting creative with these tools, but there's gotta be a better way to do this in CS2. Making realistic rivers in particular is a huge pain because of how water physics works in this game. My best advice, when making a map, start with the bodies of water and then build the map around them. Like all other custom maps I made before it, Lakeview just didn't get very far once I started playing it. I was having some weird traffic problems due to nodes at highway interchanges, and after fixing those, I then realized I just didn't find the map very fun. Knowing I didn't have time to figure out how to make a custom map fun, I just abandoned the map entirely. Thus, Cook County was born. Opting to just build the rural city on the Farmland Flats map from the Community Creator Map Pack, Cook County finally got off the ground. I'm gonna go ahead and apologize for the footage looking very inconsistent. I was messing with a new mod that would let me change graphic settings and filters on the fly, and I just couldn't seem to get the look nailed down. There were a lot of settings. I did everything I could to keep the small Midwestern US city vibe, but it didn't really feel authentic. A part of that was owed to the population density from the realistic population mod being too high, making the town feel like it was just the edge of a city core that had been deleted. Issues like this are why pro city builders will use reference photos and maps and sketch out their cities and road networks before even starting the city in-game. I did get some nice looking low density developments, but that's about all this city got right. I kinda just lost interest in doing the small Midwestern city thing by this point because I was running out of time in the project. I still had a bunch of DLCs to play and footage to collect, so I made the City of Solitude my final city on the River Plains map I was praising earlier. This was a complete 180 from Cook County, as this was going to be the ultimate high-density city. This ended up being by far the most successful city I've ever built. It was insanely profitable, which let me go crazy with its robust public transit systems. But I found out making a city really walkable actually makes the game perform worse because the AI has an easier time simulating cars and pedestrians. This is probably why the game loves spawning people with their pocket cars. Traffic became a problem despite my best efforts with building a nice beltway with a custom interchange I spent way too long building by hand. After a point, I kinda gave up trying to solve traffic and just went out to the edge of the map to build an isolated industrial zone with its own harbor. Then I built out the highway network some more and moved most of the city's industry out to the remote industrial park with its own rail terminal and warehouses. Considering no one was complaining about not having any workers, I could tell the mods were doing their jobs in helping break the will of the people and getting them to spend their time commuting. I've always taken issue with how this game's time scale works. The addition of day-night cycles and systems meant to simulate rush hour traffic based off those cycles has only made that annoyance worse. The best made-up term I can come up with to describe this issue is chronodissonance. So the game has a calendar of sorts at the bottom of the screen near the time controls. This calendar is exactly like our own. 12 months, 365 days, and each month has the correct number of days. The game even has leap days and will start on the current real-life date. The green bar seems to indicate the progression of the day, and without day-night cycles turned on, you can still imagine that being the case. The day-night cycles are not tied to this clock, however, because it would be incredibly distracting to have the screen constantly flashing as the sun rises and sets over the course of a few seconds. Certain elements and gameplay mechanics are actually tied to the day-night cycle. For example, you can set different train schedules for day and night, so the cycles are not just cosmetic, they are an element of time. So we already have two different timescales at play here, but then we throw in AI timescale, which is its own thing as well. If you decide to watch one of your citizens, you'll see them going from their home to their job and wherever else. Their days, when compared to the calendar, seems to last months, while compared to the day-night cycle, it seems to last a few days. Then you have the timescale the player operates at, which is naturally going to exist in a quantum state, because the player can manipulate the speed of the game and even stop it altogether. This does not affect what the player can do though, so it becomes its own timescale. There's a lot of implications when you think of the player's timescale in comparison to the citizens' timescale. I like to imagine what's going through my citizens' heads when 1 second they were riding on a freeway, and the next, that freeway is 300 feet to the left of them, and what's below them now is a field zoned for office buildings. Then to top it all off, you got the game's simulation speed being affected by your frame rate and the game's engine's own ability to run through its simulation code. Basically, it's impossible for me to really get a sense of how old my city is. This is actually important because citizens age, buildings level up, things progress. The passage of time is meant to mean something, but it's really hard for me to believe that when there's literally no rules dictating how it passes. It's just a thing I have to completely ignore and try to get a sense of when looking at charts. Also, it's a small thing, but just replace the real years with something that counts up from year 1. I get what they were going for, but it's kind of annoying if you're trying to make a city from the 1900s and it says the year is 2045. I honestly don't know how they'd fully address this chrono dissonance in the sort of games that they're trying to make. At the very least, though, I think the real-world calendar needs to be abandoned entirely. Make the game built around a clock instead, and that clock syncs with the day-night cycle. Make the days longer and reduce the number of days in a month to something like 10. And then you just sync the day-night cycle and the pedestrian AI to this clock. This still isn't perfect because it makes the player's quantum powers even worse, but it would be a whole lot better than what's going on in CS1. Personally, I would make my city builder turn-based. I think that one decision would solve every issue here. You'd also be able to get way more in-depth with the management mechanics and create whole new mechanics. You'd lose the instant feedback of watching the city grow in real time, but I don't really care about that. I think watching a highway project actually take years to complete and having to design detour routes would be well worth that trade-off. The game could still have day-night cycles and pedestrian AI running around living their lives, but that would simply be cosmetic when you want to tour your city. I think the importance of real-time in a lot of these building and management games is, at best, overstated, and at worst, actively holding back serious mechanical innovation in them. Let's not kid ourselves, most of us play these games paused while we're building anyways. I'm not advocating for CS to become turn-based. I think that goes against the overall design objective of the franchise, but I definitely would like to see somebody else give it a go. So with Solitude growing to be another massive population-dense city, it shouldn't come as a surprise that what ended up killing it was the simulation speed slowing down to a crawl, same as Las Vegas. I did manage to get its College of Winterhold to become the most successful campus DLC college I've ever made. As well, successfully finishing my ambitious highway development projects was pretty satisfying. Sadly, I ran out of time and patience to fill out the suburbs that highway was meant to service, so it just became a Texas highway that was built to service some predicted future demand that might likely never come to exist. I feel like I did a lot of belly aching in this video, and some viewers might get the idea that I'm being disingenuous when I say I hold this game in such high regards. The fact that I applied this much scrutiny to the game and it still came out the other side with my overall opinions of it largely unchanged, I think is proof of its quality. The truth is, explaining the core appeal of this game is just really difficult. It's like explaining to someone why you find mowing your lawn to be enjoyable, especially if that person doesn't even have a lawn. Cities Skylines scratches a certain itch I have to just watch something grow. It's really enjoyable to carve up a blank canvas with roads and neighborhoods and nudge it towards some grand vision I got in my head. I get a real sense of satisfaction out of optimizing things and tidying things up. I also love open-ended games that have no real goal or victory state. They'll just drop me into a sandbox with a bunch of tools and it's up to me to take it from there. I also like activities that feel puzzly, but they don't actually have a perfect solution, just more optimal ones that can change over time. I also really like games that react to what I'm doing, and Cities Skylines does all of this exceptionally well. It's a pretty unique game and a pretty unique genre. Definitely not for everyone, but Cities Skylines has been proving just how much broad appeal city builders actually can have. There's been tons of city builders that come out in all sorts of styles and subgenres, and I'd absolutely credit CS for kicking off this city building renaissance. But through all of that, CS1 has remained practically unopposed as a supreme classic-styled city building game, and with good reason. We'll see how CS2 pans out. I'm hopeful so far from what we've seen, but, don't pre-order digital releases, blah blah blah. What I can say is CS1 is a good game, and it's finally complete now. If CS2 flops, we'll always have this one to go back to. With the game no longer receiving DLCs and frequent patches, we might even see some really interesting stuff on the modding side of it. If you would like city builders, you're probably gonna like Cities Skylines. Just do yourself a favor and make your first few cities vanilla with no mods or DLC. Thanks for watching. This is something of a breakaway from my usual content in more ways than one. I said at the end of my Fallout 76 video I needed to do a video on a game I actually enjoyed before I went back to Skyrim, because doing nothing but Bethesda games for over a year has been wearing me out. Between the 8-year anniversary for CS1, CS2 getting announced, and me realizing there just wasn't a video like this on YouTube, I figured now was a good time to knock this one out. It's kind of funny that I don't even really play big action RPGs like the ones I mostly cover on this channel anymore. Well, not outside of doing videos on them anyways. City builders, colony builders, management games, grand strategy games, 4X games, and survival crafting games are pretty much what I've exclusively been playing for fun for many years now. I feel like they don't lend themselves as well to long-form analysis videos the way big action RPGs and especially Bethesda games lend themselves to. They got smaller audiences, smaller scopes, smaller just everything. Explaining the fun of CS proved to be as challenging to me as I figured it would be, but I want to cover more of these games in the future, but I gotta be super selective. As well, I suspect a lot of my audience isn't really into these sorts of games, so I also gotta keep that in mind. I'm gonna keep doing the big projects on big RPGs for a while longer, so don't worry if you think I'm just gonna be covering strategy games from now on. Those big RPG projects are still a ton of fun to make, and people do love them. With that said, I'm off now to go knock out this script for Skyrim Stealth video. Thank you to my patrons. This is another freebie because I'm sticking to my word that the next credited project is Skyrim Part 3. So if you gave me money since the last Skyrim video, you'll be in the credits for the next one. Anyways, have a good one, and I'll see you in the next one.